First thing I'd like to do is to thank and acknowledge my colleagues and also the ESRC for our funding, which put together many parts of this original project. As part of the larger project, we looked at evidence for mode differences by different question content, by different question formats, such as the type of task, the characteristics of the task, the implementation of the task, and also we made some recommendations. Now, you'll see at the end of my talk that this covers quite a large, detailed table, and if you want a copy of it, I've given you my email, happy to send it out. But all I can do in this 20 minutes is just give you a few highlights. So probably in terms of content, the main thing that everybody knows about with mixed modes is sensitive questions. So very well known that sensitive questions are prone to social desirability effects in interviewer modes. But if we just step back for that, even though that's really well known, you know, if you're a researcher and you're just looking at what you think is sensitive, it doesn't mean that every single one of those is actually going to show mode effects. So it can't even be guaranteed within something as obvious as social desirability. Also, there can be differences in social desirability. An obvious thing here, if we look at the Fowler et al. Reference, and it has to do with time frame. So, you know, if you have to report, I'm currently using drugs as opposed, well, I did it once in my life, obviously, there's a big difference with time frame. Anyway, at the bottom of this slide, and this is what we have, we've got different modes, and then we've got some recommendations, but I just want to point out that we've got some abbreviations. So SA is for self-administered, F2F for face-to-face, TEL for telephone, and in places we've used R for respondent, just so you're up with what we're doing. So if you have some sensitive questions, a recommendation, of course, would be self-administration. That's the obvious thing. But it's also good to remember that if you have face-to-face interviews, as Jerry's already said, you can clearly put that into paper self-administration or computer-assisted self-interview, and that is equally good. There's research to prove it's equally good. If you're dealing with telephone, what you do here, because there isn't that much literature, maybe it would be useful just to do a test to see if there are differences. So I'm going to recommend, where we're not 100% sure, that you do a test. Sorry to be using up your research money, but it's just good sometimes to have tested things with your subjects and your environment. Okay, well, what next? Things that are not sensitive. And then within that, you could look at factual versus subjective. So non-sensitive subjective questions are much more prone to mode effects than factual questions. Okay, that seems to be pretty well known. But again, it's not a universal. So in some data from our mixed mode experiment, we only had 8 factual questions, and on 7 of those 8, we saw very clear mode differences. So you're not safe there. There's also on subjective scalar questions, there could be an issue with positivity bias in telephone. So what in the world is that all about? Just a little bit of literature here for a moment. Summarizing over 2 decades of study, Dillman, we saw the Dillman 2009 reference, describes what he thinks is an oral versus visual issue, because he found substantive differences between telephone responses versus face-to-face with a show card, mail and web, with telephone response giving much more positive answers. But then there's a contrasting study by Yi et al., 2011, and they also found that telephone respondents were giving much more positive answers, but they found that face-to-face was like telephone. And unfortunately, they don't say in their study whether the face-to-face, they were doing a meta-study, whether their face-to-face was with show card, which of course it makes it visual, or without. So it's something different. They also thought it had a different cause. They thought it was due to a MUM effect, M-U-M, which is where you don't want to bear bad news that might make the listener feel uncomfortable, which would be the interviewer in this case. And there's also HOPE 2011, and in this case, yes, telephone was still very, very positive answers. And again, this is just scalar questions. And in this case, whether the face-to-face had a show card or didn't have a show card, it wasn't showing the positive answers. So differences here with mode, with telephone being very different, and more research needed. So, some recommendations. If it's factual questions, perhaps we could go with Dillman's unimode principle. We can always still test. If it's the scalar questions, obviously, be careful of telephone because of the positivity bias. And if you are going to be using face-to-face, then you should check to see if that also has the positivity bias. Okay. Something else you could say, so questions can be sensitive, factual, subjective. They could also be inherently difficult. So what's an inherently difficult question? Well, it could be something that's conceptually difficult. Maybe if you think about the 4 cognitive stages, it has to do with comprehension difficulties or recall or judgment issues and so forth. So generally one would think that people will be more likely to satisfy, give less than optimal answers if the questions are difficult. And that seems to be what a researcher would think. But at the same time, it can also be true that what researchers might think is inherently difficult is not necessarily true for respondents. So some different references there. And I'm just going to give you an example. So looking at this, what are the types of things that you like about your neighborhood? Do you like the neighborhood because of its community spirit? Now, we can all see this as a horrible question because it makes several assumptions. First of all, that respondents like their neighborhood. Second, that the given characteristics, because there's several of these, actually apply to the neighborhood. And if it applies, that it's something that the respondent actually likes about their neighborhood. But in some cognitive interviews, when we were asking respondents about this, or how easy or difficult was it to answer these questions, and we had respondents saying it was easy. And when we asked, well, why was that? We had, well, you know, it's just about straightforward, everyday kinds of things. So they did not, respondents had no difficulty with it, even though we would call it inherently difficult. Okay, so how does that affect things, recommendations? So just generally in questionnaire design, perhaps we should actually test things to see what respondents think are difficult. One possibility could be with some cognitive interviewing. In the mixed modes context, it would be useful to test questionnaires where we think are inherently difficult across modes so we can actually see if there's going to be differences or not. Because of course some questions truly are difficult and respondents will think that and researchers will think that. Okay, let's take a breath for a moment. Sorry, this is just lots of stuff all at once. You can have the table and look at it in depth. Okay, next thing we could look at is mark all that apply versus yes or no. So here we have 8 different ways that you could reduce poverty, or you could turn them into separate questions. Thank you, Jerry. So what do we know about mark all that apply? Of course, you might be used to hearing it as check all that apply or tick all that apply, depending on methods of data collection. Anyway, Summit and Bradburn suggested that the absence of a tick mark could mean that the item did not apply to the respondent did not notice the item, or the respondent did not know how to answer the item. So lots of confusion there. Brzezinski et al. 1994, Smith et al. 2006, and Thomas and Klein 2006 found that mark all that apply has a lower endorsement for items than the equivalent yes or no for each. And they show this replicated across lots of different behavioral topics, languages, and countries of residence. Smith et al. 2006 found that mark all that apply, when people took less time to complete it, there was actually evidence of primacy effects, which Jerry mentioned, where people are choosing from the top of the list. And in Nicholas et al. 2011, although we didn't find evidence of primacy effects, we did find people took less time in that format. What about the mixed mode context? Smith et al. 2008, using a student sample, found no differences with the yes or no across telephone and web. However, Nicholas et al., using a probability sample of the adult population, did find differences. With one question set, there were differences between the interview surveys versus web. With a different question set, there were differences between telephone versus face-to-face versus web. So again, an area where more research would be needed. So in terms of recommendations, tick all that apply, mark all that apply, whatever you want to call it, is prone to, we all know this is prone to lower reporting of items, quicker processing, possibly primacy effects, so maybe it's just kind of best to avoid. However, it's very ironic because it doesn't tend to show mode effects. Of course, you couldn't do it in telephone, but you could compare face-to-face with self-administration. What about yes or no for each? Strongly supported by the work of Smith, but we have to realize that there's always problems. It can take longer to complete the questionnaire, and of course, if you've really got long lists of yes or no, that can be very burdensome and take away some of the positive aspects. But from this particular piece of research, we would suggest that you should test yes or no if you're going to put it into different modes. All right, another format example. Yes, okay, ranking versus rating. So here we have a ranking example. And you're going to put those 7 things in order. Or we could improve our neighborhood by taking these as 7 different questions with a rating scale with a scale of importance. So what do we know in general about ranking versus rating? Ranking demands considerable concentration, sophistication, particularly as the list gets long. Ranking results can be affected by primacy effects. Ranking effects produces better data than rating, supposedly, some authors on that. So despite some of the difficulties, it's actually been shown to have higher test-retest reliability and cross-sectional reliability, higher validity of factor structure, and respondents are less likely to answer in an incorrect format. In the mixed modes context, we look at rating. Rating is susceptible to non-differentiation, where you just pick the same thing all the way down, and that's more likely to happen in web than telephone. That's the, that's the Fricker example here. Similarly, in a different study, rating was more susceptible to non-differentiation in web or telephone as compared to face-to-face. And then picking on ranking, more susceptible to non-differentiation in web. So there seems to be more problems in the web mode, generalizing over that. So recommendations, ranking. We could use it in face-to-face, but remember it's more difficult the longer the list. Problematic in telephone, you can't call somebody up and give them 9 items to think about in their head and put in the order at the same time. Maybe 3 categories, maybe 4, might get away with it. Ranking's often very problematic in self-administered modes because people don't do it right. They like duplicates, they like skipping things. And then you think, well, the answers to the web survey will just enforce this, but rather than doing that, you may just irritate or confuse people and they break out of your web survey. If we're looking at rating, ideally we avoid long sequences of questions that might make this prone, particularly if we're planning to have web survey respondents, because we know of the non-differentiation in web and then possibly telephone. And you could try to be clever and try doing a ranking task, do a rating task, but then do a ranking of duplicates from the rating. Another format, agree-disagree. So here we have an example of one. And here we have some problems just in general with agree-disagree. And you can get me talking about that, and there's at least 6 other things that we could talk about with agree-disagree. But what do we know about the mixed modes context? So HOPE 2011 found more acquiescence in the interview modes, okay, and that wasn't present in self-administered, but we found a different type of satisficing in the web version. We had more middle category choosing. So satisficing was taking place in different ways if you consider the social desirability to be a type of satisficing. So perhaps as a recommendation, maybe we should avoid agree-disagree, and there's lots to be said if you know the Wim Saris article about using item-specific formats instead. Use of the middle category. I think for the sake of time, there's a lot of literature on this one. I'll let you read it in the full table if you're interested. Let me just say a little bit about the mixed mode side of this. More use of the middle category in visual as opposed to oral modes. Now, Tarnay and Dillman thought this was greater use of the middle category because the middle category is more prominent in a visual mode. But HOPE 2011 also found the same thing, more selection of middle categories, but this is slightly different. More selection of middle categories on end labeled as opposed to fully labeled, but less so in telephone. And evidence from the cognitive interviewing of the study suggested an explanation. It suggests that respondents have a difficult time finding a middle category on an oral end labeled scale. So it's not so much that the visual makes it stick out, it's the fact that oral makes it difficult to find. So in general, there's more use of a middle category in web, as we already saw in that study there. So again, lots of differences just with middle category usage. So some recommendations, probably best not to use middle categories in a mixed mode study because they are treated differently. And be careful if you're going to use telephone interviews with end labels. Okay, so just the overall typology that this came from. I've only had a chance to pick out the few things in red so you can see it's part of a much bigger scheme. So in summary, mode is a characteristic of the question. Jerry and I decided to put the same statement in there, and you can question it, which you already have. Good questionnaire design is key to minimizing many measurement differences, but we are unlikely to eliminate all differences because satisficing is different in different modes, and that's what's particularly problematic. And I hope I've shown you some examples of that. But we need to somehow assess any remaining differences and find some ways perhaps to adjust for this. So I've just got a few last slides to think about this. So first of all, what would be some quality indicators for measurement error? Would we want to look at item non-response or length of responses to open questions, mean number of responses to mark all that apply, psychometric scaling principles, reliability and validity, can we compare to a gold standard, and so on and so on and so on. So have that in the back of your mind, and then we'd have to have a design. What kind of design do we have? Can we actually randomly assign respondents to different modes? That might not actually be possible. Or if we random group changes during the mode, that's been also tried. But in both cases, these kinds of designs suffer if there's differential non-response between the modes. Or you could have a design where the respondent chooses their mode of data collection, which supposedly might reduce non-response, but selection and measurement error effects are confounded. We could compare a mixed mode study to a comparable single mode study. That's been done. We can obviously try different statistical modeling techniques or look at propensity score matching. So all of these things have been tried, just to give you the wide variety of what's going on. And I'm not going to advocate one thing over another, just to say what's been out there. Because ideally, what we're trying to do depends on the type of analysis that we're going to be doing. You know, are we just reporting means? Are we looking at percentages for extreme categories? Are we percentages for all categories? Are we doing more elaborate kinds of analysis like multinomial regression, whatever? And it also depends on the reporting needs. So, you know, if it doesn't matter in our reporting whether there's 5% difference here or there, then that's fine. But if it's something like unemployment statistics, 5% difference here or there, it is not good enough. Let's have 1/100% difference here or there, something very small and precise. So we need to think about our overall purposes with this also. So ideally, we need more understanding of both the theoretical and practical side of things, more awareness of specific question attributes that make certain questions less portable across modes, and more knowledge and confidence in actually executing our mixed modes questionnaires. So hopefully our talk's given you a bit more along these lines. And thank you for listening. And if you're interested in the table I keep talking about, just send me an email. Thank you.